I'll now pass over to our first speaker, Jean Palutikof, who of course I know very well, but just to make sure I get things right, I've written down an introduction here for her. So Professor Jean Palutikof, she was here at UEA in the Climatic Research Unit for 25 years, eventually becoming co-director. She's now on our screens now. Hello, Jean. She then led the Technical Support Unit of the IPCC's Working Group 2 at the Met Office before moving to Australia to establish the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility at Griffith University, from where she joins us today. Over to you, Jean.
Okay, Tim, thank you. I actually can't see you anymore, which is a bit sad, so I'm speaking into the void. But I'll do my best here.
Perfect. Thank
you. So I'm talking today about transitioning climate change information into policy action. And let's just see where we are. First of all, I thought I'd just say a few words about where I am, because I'm currently work at Griffith University, and I have to say, when I first heard about the job, I had no idea where Griffith University was. So I thought you might be in the same boat. So I thought I'd first of all say where we are. We're here in southeast Queensland. Griffith University is in South Brisbane and southeast Queensland. And I actually work on the Gold Coast campus. This is the Gold Coast. It would probably be more appropriate to see it located in Florida than in Australia, but this is how it looks. And this is the building that I work in. Yep. I still can't see you. So there's still a technical issue, but no matter. And the second thing I thought I'd say a little bit about is who am I and why am I here? Because not many of you will be familiar with the work that I do. But the reason why I'm here is that I worked at the Climatic Research Unit between 1979 and 2004, so just shy of 25 years. And eventually I was the co-director with Phil Jones for the last 6 years of that time. So I guess that's why I got the invitation to speak. And Tim and everyone at the Climatic Research Unit, thank you very much for that invitation. Just to say a little bit about what I've done over the years, I began my career at the University of Nairobi, moved to the Climatic Research Unit in 1979, and then from there I went to the Met Office in 2004, and then eventually here to Australia in 2008. And the things that I'll be saying here today are not about the work that I did in the Climatic Research Unit. There'll be post-2004 reflections. So as Tim said, between 2004 and 2008, I worked as the head of the Technical Support Unit for the delivery of the 4th assessment of the IPCC for Working Group 2, which is Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability. And the co-chairs at that time were Martin Parry and Osvaldo Canziani, Martin from the UK and Osvaldo from Argentina. And in 2008, I moved to be director of the National Climate Change Adaptation Research Facility. It was set up by the federal government in Australia, and its role was to build knowledge and capacity to adapt to climate change among Australian policy and decision makers. And just a few definitions and just to say a little bit more about what I hope to cover. So what I want to talk about today is how to transition knowledge into practice. So how to transition scientific knowledge into practice where that knowledge is useful and usable by policymakers and decision makers. And also to say a little bit about why it's important to do that and to do it well. And just a couple of definitions for you then. Some people talk about climate services as being that delivery of knowledge to decision makers. So here, for our purposes in this talk, is a definition for climatic services, the transformation of climate-related data and other relevant information into customized products and any other service in relation to climate that may be of use to society at large. Very, very general definition, very broad brush, taking into account all aspects of climate knowledge. And the other one is co-production, the useful term that I'll use in this presentation, the deliberate collaborative product development work between climate scientists or producers of climate data and practitioners or useful or users. So those are two definitions that I think will be useful in this talk, which is about how to transition knowledge into practice and why it's important to do that. And I'll just go through 3 case studies. The first from my work at the Met Office, working on the IPCC 4th assessment. The second from working at NCARF and the build of a decision support framework for coastal managers, which is Coast Adapt. And if you're sitting there with your iPad or your mobile phone, you can actually, I think, have a look at Coast Adapt, although it was down last week. I think it's back up now, coastadapt.com.au. And finally, also from NCARF, some very recent work that we're still doing, we're still contracted to do with Queensland Health to build a risk assessment and management system for climate change evaluation by health managers in the hospitals and health services in Queensland. So let's just begin then by looking at the case of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and some reflections on my job when I worked for the 4th assessment. So I was the head of the technical support unit, which meant that I was responsible for the day-to-day management of the whole process. And that gave me insights into how the process works, what are the flaws, what are the strengths, and how it manages over the years to develop these very insightful, robust and extensive reports into all aspects of climate change knowledge. And this is the process that the IPCC goes through. Pretty much, it never changes. It's pretty much the same in every cycle. This is what we followed for the 4th assessment. And as far as I know, the 5th and 6th assessments went through very similar, if not identical, processes. So it begins with the election, the cycle begins with the election of the chair, the co-chairs and the bureau, takes the panel itself takes a decision to produce a report. An outline of the report is approved by the panel, and the authors and review editors are selected mainly by the bureau and then approved again by the panel. And once that's done and the whole structure is set up for the new assessment, the cycle begins with the production of a zero-order draft, which goes through a review process, a first-order draft, which also goes through a review process, and so on and so forth until you get to the delivery of the final government draft, which goes for review. And eventually then there is the approval meeting for the summary for policymakers. And once the governments approve the summary for policymakers, the underlying report is also agreed and the whole thing can go with some editorial work for publication. And that whole process takes between 5 and 6 years. And it is very much a co-production process between governments and scientists. And because it's a co-production process between governments and scientists, I would say neither side is ever completely happy, but nevertheless, there is a product at the end of it, and that product is approved by governments and therefore can become the basis for decision makers at venues such as the conferences of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Once the text of the summary for policymakers is approved by governments, then in a way they're bound into the statements that are in that summary for policymakers. And this is what an approval meeting looks like, which is a whole bunch of people sitting in a room for many, many days, looking line by line at the text of the draft summary for policymakers. It's very much, nobody smokes anymore, but if they did, it would be very much a process of smoke-filled rooms. This just shows you some of the conversations that go on in the margins of the whole process. Some of you will recognise David Warrilow there, talking to some of the delegates and government representatives at the approval meeting. And when the whole thing is over and the gavel goes down, the summary for policymakers is approved, and the chair here, Pachauri, and the secretary to the IPCC here, Renata Christ, are very happy people. Just to give you some idea of what happens in the approval meeting for the summary for policymakers, this is just one piece of text. So the summary for policymakers, as you know, is a document of, probably gets longer and longer, but should really be of the order of 10 to 15 pages, which attempts for each working group to summarise the content of the whole report. And at the approval meeting, each phrase in the summary is projected onto a screen, and the government representatives go through it and approve each phrase. So it's an extremely laborious process. This just shows you some of the changes that can occur. So this is a little piece of text from the chapter, from the section in the SPM on ecosystems. The underlying chapter is the ecosystems chapter, which was led by Andreas Fischlin and Guy Midgley. And you can see that in the final government review, the text said roughly 20 to 30% of species are likely to be at high risk of irreversible extinction if global average temperature increase exceeds 1.5 to 2.5 degrees Celsius. If you just keep your eye on that middle piece of that phrase, which is likely to be at high risk of irreversible extinction, you can see how it changes through the process. So at the approval meeting, the text had already changed during the final government review. And so it then said 20 to 30% of species will be committed to extinction if increases in global average temperature exceed 1.5 to 2.5 Celsius. And after the approval meeting, the final published and approved text said approximately 20 to 30% of plant and animal species assessed so far, so it was qualified correctly, qualified, that are likely to be at increased risk of extinction if increases in global average temperature exceed 1.5 to 2.5 Celsius. So you can see how the text evolves and how very often there are rumours that governments have interfered with the scientists' findings. And this is just some reporting in the media, I think from the 5th assessment report, or maybe from the 6th actually, where the media got the idea that in this particular case, the Australian government has interfered with the scientists' findings in the IPCC report. Yes, well, the governments do interfere. It's their role almost to interfere. Their role in the approval meeting for the summary for policymakers is to ensure that the final text is acceptable to governments, such that when they go to the conferences of the parties, the text can form a foundation for the negotiations that take place at those meetings. And if they didn't have an agreed text, they wouldn't have a foundation to go forward. So inevitably, in order for all the governments to sign up to the text that's in the summary for policymakers, there has to be some change which makes the text agreeable to all those governments. And I think that's one of the problems with attempts at co-design and co-production and effective delivery of knowledge to policymakers, is that the purity of the scientific statements can be, what's a good word that I could use? Well, the purity of the text is affected, let us say, in some ways. It doesn't carry through exactly as a scientist would like it, but nevertheless, it is acceptable to the policymakers. And you can see then how the evolution of scientific statements changes through the different assessment reports by the IPCC. And although the scientists might like the text to be stronger at each assessment round than eventually is delivered after the approval meeting, nevertheless, over time, the text does strengthen. And when you look at it like this, it strengthens hugely. So in the first assessment report, it was that there was insufficient evidence to make any statement about observed global warming. And in the second assessment report, it was quite tentative that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human influence. And by the third assessment report, it was beginning to harden a little bit. Most of the observed warming is likely to have been due to an increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. And then in the fourth assessment report, it really landed. Warming of the climate system is unequivocal. So Susan Solomon's managed to get that statement through the approval meeting, and it had, I think, a tremendous effect on how the negotiations went forward at the conferences of the party. And since then, it's just strengthened further. So in the fifth assessment, they repeated the statement, warming of the climate system is unequivocal, and added that many observed changes are unprecedented over decades to millennia. And now in the sixth assessment report, all that is stated again, that the warming is unequivocal and unprecedented, and has added a statement about extremes and their attribution to human influence. So gradually over time, irrespective of concerns about the relationship between scientists and government officials, and how that plays through in approval meetings. Nevertheless, the IPCC has hugely strengthened the remarks it's made about global warming. So just to conclude that little whiz through the processes of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, what I'd say is that the role of the IPCC is to provide evidence-based material for decision-making processes at the conferences of the parties. And the processes demonstrate the importance of consensus building to arrive at an agreed understanding of climate change, agreed between scientists and government officials, government representatives, what causes it, how it's evolving, how it will evolve in the future, the severity of the challenge, and how it can be met. And therefore to build a platform at international level from which action can be taken. And we've got a paper coming out in Environmental Science and Policy, which is about how the review process works in the IPCC. If any of you are interested, that should appear in the next couple of weeks. Now, just to think a little bit about my work at NCARF, and in particular about COAST-ADAPT, but a bit of background. So NCARF was founded in 2007. It's a federal government funded body, or was, until 2017. It was co-funded by the federal government, and therefore had to be quite responsive to the various government officials that we had to deal with and how they reflected their political masters. So by the time NCARF really got going in phase one, we were dealing with a Labour government. Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard were the prime ministers, and a bit unlike what is happening in the UK at the moment, Kevin Rudd did come back briefly, but then we moved into a series of what are essentially conservative governments in Australia, which has made life more difficult for NCARF to obtain funding from the federal government. But we did obtain support to build this risk assessment and management framework, COAST-ADAPT, under the Conservative government. But really since 2017, 2018, we have not had funding from the federal government, or not at least core funding. We have had individual contracts. And in 2018, I stood down as director of NCARF. It seemed an appropriate thing to do at that time as we moved on to a more contract-based model of funding. And currently I'm paid by the Wellcome Trust, the philanthropic institution in the UK, to do work on heat stress in Bangladesh. And I also have a contract from Queensland Health continuing to look at this risk assessment and management framework. And these are some of the publications. We've produced an awful lot of material over the years because we had very, very good funding. We had $50 million for the first round of NCARC for the 5 years, and we have $9 million for the production of Coast Adapt. So we've been well funded by the federal government. So just a little bit about co-production in Coast Adapt. And I thought I would just look at it might be of interest to just look at the beginning of the process of designing Coast Adapt and how we interacted with our potential users to understand exactly what it was that they wanted. And we went out and talked to a lot of people, but we also did a survey, and I'm just going to show you a few results from the survey because I think they're quite interesting. Our target audience for the survey was federal, national and local government, business and industry, anybody interested in the coastal zone, because that was our target location as specified by the federal government. They told us, we want you to build a framework for coastal managers because they're not dealing very well with the issues around sea level rise, riverine flooding and so on and so forth. So we carried out a survey, and this shows you some results from the survey. In this survey, in these survey results, we have taken out the responses that we got from university staff and students because we were more interested in potential practitioners and how they might use Coast Adapt and how we should design it for what they needed. And just a few results here. So we asked them, what do you see are the impacts of climate change in the coastal zone that you need to address? And they told us that they needed to think about storm surge impacts on the natural environment and extreme events. When you take the results apart and separate out the private sector from the public sector, then you find that the private sector is much more concerned about the impacts on property values and insurance pricing than the public sector is, which is what you would expect. We asked them, what are the barriers to you actually doing something about dealing with climate change, the barriers to progressing planning for climate change in the coastal zone, and government respondents very much felt that lack of leadership was the problem for them. I think if you repeated this survey now, you'd probably get different results because we've moved now with the new Labour government into a much more assertive approach to dealing with climate change. The private sector really felt that vested interests, particularly property developers, were the real barriers to action to address the challenges of climate change, and also concerns around scientific uncertainty. We asked them about what the knowledge gaps are, and reasonably they were concerned about the climate change science, but also they're very interested in the context within which planning for climate change takes place. So not the climate context, but the context, the legal context and the regulatory context. What are the planning regulations? What are the planning laws that we have to act within in order to address the challenges from climate change and sea level rise? And they were just as important as concerns about, you know, how much is sea level going to rise, what's the risks around storm surge. And we responded to that by putting a lot in Coast Adapt around the different regulatory frameworks and planning regulations in the different states and territories of Australia. And finally, we asked them what guidance do they need, and they really landed on needing it to be authoritative and needing to recognise the differences in the regulatory framings of the different states and territories, because unfortunately, planning for the coastal zone is not dealt with at the federal level, it's dealt with at the state level. And so there are changes across the state and territory boundaries in how climate change and sea level rise can be addressed because of the regulatory frameworks. If you do it right, then you'll end up with a tool that is useful in the long term. So these orange and blue lines that you see in these graphs show you users at two different time periods. The orange is the earlier period, just after Coast Adapt went live, and the blue line is the most recent period up to June 30th, 2022. And you can see that our users have stuck with us over time, and Coast Adapt is still a useful tool. And in fact, the federal government have just funded us to the tune of $650,000 to update Coast Adapt and make sure that, in particular, the legal and regulatory frameworks for the states and territories are still up to date, because planning regulation is changing all the time. That just shows you where our users are, and that gives you the parts of the Coast Adapt that are most used. And to conclude that section, it's possible to construct useful and usable support for adaptation decision making, but it takes time and it takes willingness, both by the providers and the recipients, to work to understand what is required and how it can be effectively delivered and supported. And it takes money, and it takes a long-term commitment, which can make funding agencies quite nervous. So finally, just a very brief look at risk assessment for Queensland Health, which is what one of the projects we're currently working on. We have produced quite substantial material for health service managers to undertake climate risk assessment and management. We have guidelines, and which is about a 60-page document. We have an almanac, which contains knowledge around climate change, so that when the users go through the guidelines, they can refer to the almanac for information on how climate is expected to change in their region. And we've provided templates for them to fill in. And we've undertaken lots and lots of training workshops across the state for potential users, and led them through how to fill in the templates and produce their own risk assessment. But now we're going back to produce a more straightforward, more simple set of templates for them to use. Well, it's a single worksheet, a single Excel file with a number of worksheets, because they've told us in no uncertain terms that they can't work with what we have provided because it's simply too complicated. They need something which is more straightforward for them in their limited time. And so we conclude from that and we know decision makers have limited time to devote to climate change and action to address the risks. Nearly all of the decision makers and practitioners that we deal with have other concerns around, for example, how to keep the lights on in the street and how to deal with rubbish collections. And that needs to be recognised and it needs to be accommodated. And it's also the case that for this project with Queensland Health, we have worked with two individuals who have been very keen to make this happen, and an ambassador for your work really helps, but can also be a weakness, because if they move on, it may be quite difficult to keep the work going to help it to progress. So those are this slide is simply a collection of the 9 conclusions that I've shown you through this presentation. That from the IPCC, consensus building is vital. It's necessary to build a foundation from which action can be taken and to win hearts and minds. From Coast Adapt, we learned that it's possible to construct and deliver useful and usable information, but it takes time and willingness on all sides, and that in turn takes money and a long-term commitment by funders. And finally, from the Queensland Health work, decision makers have limited time for us. We need to recognise and accommodate that as information providers. And if we have an ambassador for our work, that can be wonderful. But if they move on, that can be a challenge for us. So thank you. That's all I would like to say in this presentation. Thank you, Tim, for the information, for the invitation.
Thanks, Jean. I'm not sure if you can hear me or not.
I can just.
You can just. Okay, sorry. Apologies, you probably missed my 1-minute warning. Given that you probably didn't hear that, I think we'll still take a brief moment for a question or two. We have about 45 people in the room and up to, I think, 95 registered online. So perhaps any questions in the room? First of all, if you do have a question, then we have a roving microphone for you to use. I think Asher down here has one. And while Asher's asking his question, Emily, are there any questions online? Not yet, no.
Hello, Jean. It's Asher Minns here from the Tyndall Centre. One job you very kindly gave me a few years ago was to review a little bit of the Coast Adapt materials that were coming out, and they were really good. And using co-production, I could see how had been co-produced with your stakeholders. So several years on, I'm really interested to know. Do you feel that the work itself had an impact? What changed in the Gold Coast? Hopefully something from that really solid body of work that you did, and great to hear that it's carrying on as well. So thank you.
So oddly enough, the Coast Adapt wasn't really targeted to the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast is a big council. It's quite rich. It employs its own scientists. We really were focusing Coast Adapt on smaller councils that had fewer resources and could use Coast Adapt as a foundation for work on climate change, even though they were not in any way qualified and didn't have a strong background in climate change. They could go to Coast Adapt, find what they needed, and build a case to take to their managers for support to do work in climate change. And we have never had support to go out and interrogate users to find what the impact is that Coast Adapt has had. So we only have anecdotal evidence. That anecdotal evidence suggests that we did hit the mark, and smaller councils, for example, in some of the rural areas of South Australia, have found Coast Adapt a very strong support in making a case to councils to take action around climate change. But we don't have funding, unfortunately, to go out and establish that objectively.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks again for your talk. Hope you can stay around, even though it's quite late in the evening, stay around for the rest of the meeting if possible.